5 seconds of insight. That was the gift we received from the colossal creature that reached the minds of every man, woman, and child on Earth as it crashed. The creature was massive, surpassing anything on Earth, and beyond even what scientists had reasoned could be the upper limits for the size of any coherent creature. It approached the size of complex multi-organism collectives, like the aspen groves of North America. It broke through the atmosphere and crashed into an abandoned stretch of the Sahara, the remoteness meaning that it took hours for even the earliest and swiftest aircraft and helicopters to reach the site. By the time they arrived, it was already gasping its dying breaths. The harsh desert conditions did not seem to help, as the creature had soft skin and appeared to be originally amphibious in nature. Scientists agreed that a few hours earlier would not have made a difference given the stress from the impact itself. Astronomers also noted that as they had recorded the entity approaching Earth, initially thinking it was just an oddly shaped asteroid predicted to miss us by a few million miles, it made deliberate trajectory changes to avoid inhabited regions. This added to the growing body of evidence that this creature was intelligent. Because it communicated with so many all at once, many believed it was a god or something akin to it. In the years that followed, there would be cults and religions that would spring up here and there, with worshippers hoping to again hear the words in their heads, the two words that everyone had understood, regardless of language: defend yourselves. It bestowed upon us a blessing of foresight, the ability to perceive our own personal reality 5 seconds into the future. While some decried this as worthless or useless, it immediately meant that injuries and deaths from accidents and preventable instantaneous causes dropped precipitously. Indeed, even hectic and dangerous activities and regions seemed to resemble almost abstract ballets, with participants moving past each other with fluid grace as if they had practiced in unison for decades. Each of their own foresights allowed them to move without injury or conflict. Researchers hypothesized that the entity had a far longer ability to project into the future, something that, when the fragments among all of humanity were tallied up, would have meant more than a millennia of knowledge about what the future might hold. The implications startled all of us to think that even this had not been enough to defend it, and that it had instead sought to distribute its gift among all of us. But humanity is nothing if not ingenious. We realized we had been given a gift, and the human mind and drive for curiosity and experimentation led us to find how we could make the most of it. Years passed, and we found that each new generation born also carried the gift. Many of them, in many of their first words, echoed those of the fallen god in their own language. Infants communicating a legacy they had never heard. But we had a breakthrough. While there was no ability to extend our own personal foresight, it was found that a chain of humans standing nearby to each other could add their respective foresights together. The group would be prompted with a question, and the person in the back would use their foresight to determine if the person ahead of them responded with yes or no. The person ahead of them would do the same for the person ahead of them, and so on and so forth, each allowing a tiny 5-second jump forward. Through this, with the first larger groups of volunteers, insights more significantly into the future were gained. The first breakthrough came when 100,000 volunteers were gathered in a large stadium and weeks of insight were obtained. There was to be a natural disaster, an earthquake in a densely populated area. Combined with a festival that would have been occurring at the same time, it would have meant the loss of hundreds of lives. However, this chain of foresight was able to see and forewarn against this disaster. As a result, the affected region was almost uninhabited when the destruction would have occurred. This spurred renewed interest in the project, and volunteers poured in. Organizations formed to help prepare groups regionally and link across distances and languages. The initial questions were typically only yes or no, something quick that could be signified with the right or left hand, as that was the easiest to train volunteers on and had the fewest difficulties. But even these yielded titanic insights. As the milestone of 500,000 volunteers came, there was palpable excitement, and the first question asked was, "Has the threat come?" The response, after several minutes of signals and waiting, was that a year and a half into the future, humanity was still safe. The impact that such a threat had been having on those remembering the warnings of the Elder God meant that there was some relief, some celebrations, but many more took this as a sign that humanity could do more, should do more. Thus began the great drive for an even longer chain of foresight, the first of what would truly be a prophecy in any other era. Over 1 million volunteers were gathered, and nearly a decade of our future was laid bare. There were only 3 questions asked, for the organizers realized that even among the willing cohesion of such a large group for a singular purpose, is not something to be spent idly or unwisely. The questions were simply, has the threat arrived yet? Has humanity prepared for the threat? Have we managed to reach the stars? The last was an aspirational question, one that was strongly requested by the various aeronautical organizations among the countries of Earth. The answers that returned were that the threat had not yet arrived in a decade's time. Humanity also, to little surprise, had not prepared adequately for such a threat. But people were heartened by the reply that humanity had indeed reached the stars, and it redoubled efforts into spaceflight and planetary colonization. Some argued that it was a self-fulfilling prophecy, that humanity only achieved this because we thought we were going to achieve it, and thus it was not anything special at all. But the knowledge that work done is not done in vain is a motivating factor beyond almost any other. It was this that many credited with helping ensure that humanity would no longer be a single planet species. Nearly a decade on, and humans had begun the colonization of all habitable planets within our system, with our eyes toward the stars and what places we might inhabit there as well. This was also the culmination of the second great chain of foresight. There had been other smaller ones in the years since, some even rivaling the size of the first, but this was to be something altogether larger. Fully 1 billion of the 10 billion humans that existed on Earth or her colonies were participating in a single long chain of foresight, aided by exceptional communication networks across the entire system. And the insight we gained was more than a century and a half into the future. Again, the first two questions were asked: if humanity had faced the threat, and if we were prepared for it. The third question was no longer whether we should reach for the stars, but whether we had found anyone else who knew of this threat and could help us prepare for it. Again, as before, to the relief of many, the first answer was no. The threat had not yet been found. Wearily, the answer to the second question was half-hearted. Humanity had begun some preparations, but of course not knowing what we were facing made it difficult to design a weapon against an enemy we knew nothing about. However, the third question found that we had indeed found traces of others. The answers to the chain of foresight were unfortunately brief, but knowing that something was out there to give us more information filled many with hope that all would not be lost. This second great chain of foresight heralded a turning point. The gift the other god had given us changed many behaviors once thought innate to humans. Self-serving behaviors and fears melted away as primary motivations, as all immediate threats to our health and safety could be avoided. The actions of the great chains of foresight provided reassurances and certainty that religions had never been able to fully promise. Humanity expanded our reach across the stars, hoping we might encounter others, but fearing that the lack of other species among our interstellar travels was the fault of this great threat. At last, we found traces, mentions not only of a great threat, but also disturbingly echoes of the very same dying elder being from which we had gained our powers. The annals of other cultures were uncovered one by one in a meticulous search of every possible stable planet within the Milky Way. We found that this gift had been given to others, a boon granted by a mighty god falling from the sky in a death throes each time. The amount of foresight granted to other species varied based on the number of individuals on the planet in question, but it was seldom more than a minute at most, and for all the cultures recorded, they had similar impacts. It resembled what happened with humanity: peaceful interaction, reduction of harm, accident avoidance, and secure knowledge that at least the immediate future was safe. However, we found no signs of a chain of foresight in these species, no greater perceptions beyond the scant few seconds they were given. In every single one of these cultures, the record was cut off, with the comment that an unspeakable force had come to wipe them out. They were fragments, snippets of descriptions that had survived destruction, and from these snippets, a tapestry and account were woven together, repaired from the ruins of a dozen cultures and their desolated worlds. We found that the entity that destroyed each of them resembled, and was, in fact, the same entity that had granted the powers in the first place. The elder god that we thought was larger than any creature that could possibly exist was a mere vestige, a digit upon a limb upon a creature of a size that dwarfed solar systems. Thus, we realized that this entity that crashed on the planet was not a sign of goodwill or a defense against an outside force, but rather a gauntlet, a blade thrown at the feet of those to prepare them for battle. And thus far, no species had proven its equal. The news of this rocked Earth and the countless outlying worlds that formed the greater human empire. The religions based on this elder god as some kind of divine savior crumbled, sparking civil wars that lasted a generation in some regions. But out of the ashes of this revelation came renewed determination to oppose the threat for which we had been given this gift. The chains of foresight were strengthened, organizations made formal and a part of required citizenship, and almost all took this service as a minor inconvenience at worst. But most saw it as a solemn duty to help safeguard their species. The chain of foresight now numbered in the tens of billions, as humanity had expanded and found habitable worlds. Populations exploded to just shy of 1 trillion individuals across the entire arm of the Milky Way, each gifted with that flash of insight that together could pierce the veil of the future. With each generation, the chain of foresight grew, and soon the response changed. 1,500 years out, humanity had indeed met the enemy. But each time we were not prepared, the answer to the second and vital question being, no, not yet. Until, after centuries of dedicated weapons development and probing surveys sent to the regions where we suspected the entity lurked, it was found. Hiding in a dimension adjacent to our own, detectable only through the way it warped space and matter around it, we had found it. Through further observations, capabilities were assessed, weaknesses identified, and a plan put into motion. This took dozens more generations, for the entity we had realized could perceive 1,000 years into its future. So our trap had to be extensive, thorough, inescapable, and inevitable. Entire solar systems were harvested, suns made into Dyson spheres and then linked to containment projectors across the interstellar systems, forming a cage that could be activated to contain the entity within. Of course, immediate activation would have been detected far before the button could even be flipped. So instead, it was gradual. The analogy from the archaic days on Earth was to boil a frog, a brutal term used to depict a pot of water and an unfortunate amphibian creature within, not altogether unlike the entity we now faced, lurking in their subdimension. If dropped into hot water, the frog would leap out as the temperature increased, so instead it needed to be scaled subtly so it did not realize what was happening. We needed to boil it alive, without it realizing. We were not certain of what could kill the beast, but probably knew we needed to keep it in one place while we determined what could, as the loss of containment would mean the loss of our entire race. So the containment was activated, so minuscule at first that it was barely detectable, something that even the most sensitive of instruments struggled to confirm that occurred, and something that would provide no more of a barrier to the creature than mere gossamer. But as the years ticked on, it slowly increased, bit by bit, part by part. Hundreds of years passed, and we waited anxiously as we watched the entity for signs of movement, fearing it could escape containment at this crucial juncture. But it did not stir, slumbering and waiting. The critical point was reached and passed, just in time. Not even a century later, we began to detect movement as the entity's own foresight revealed that it was contained. But it was too late for the Elder God, for the cage was now secure and tightening. Cautious incrementation gave way to almost immediate full-strength power now that the trap was sprung, and thrashed though it might, the entity that stretched larger than star systems was locked within a cage of power, invisible and imperceptible to life in this dimension. It was locked both in space, and we had taken care to ensure that this net prevented travel and return to our dimension, or any other as well. So we had trapped our god, our challenger, and while some hoped it might humble itself, apologize, or otherwise show submission, instead it raged beyond all reason. Our cage held, but only barely, as it lashed out with every ounce of power it possessed. But still, our trap, laid with the care of generations upon generations, held without wavering. Weapons were deployed and fired into the dimensional pocket it was trapped within, but none were able to eradicate the beast. Finally, one terrible solution came to the forefront. Through all of our experimentation, seeking to find a weapon that could harm the entity, only once had the chain of foresight shortened, threatening us with nothing but an end to humanity sooner than the arrival of the great Elder God. Upon careful backtracking, we found that a series of innocuous experiments in an almost forgotten corner of the Alpha Centauri solar system had inadvertently triggered a cascade. It appeared that the stability and universality of the strong nuclear force was, in reality, a plateau. An inadvertent push could send it over the edge of this plateau of stability. The result was that its interaction could extend to greater distances than merely those of particles within an atom, causing all matter within the entire dimension to condense into one mass at the speed of light. We had carefully checked, and this tipping appeared to affect only the dimension in which the push had occurred. Not seeing another option, we deployed what could theoretically be called a weapon, but would accurately be called a universe killer. It was fired, And the most disturbing part was that if it weren't for our sensors, we wouldn't have realized that we had just killed everything within this subdimension. The entity was gone, eradicated into a single mass. As the mass grew and grew in this alternate dimension, it warped the very fabric of space in that dimension, allowing any remaining matter that had not yet been consumed to hurtle at many millions of times the speed of light into the center of the supermassive black hole. The effect was finally even felt in our dimension, ships and planets caught as if by an invisible tide, dragged towards the center of our trap, now deactivated and dismantled as the subdimension continued to die. Finally, our sensors detected no more increases in mass, all remaining elements stripped from the adjacent dimension, and only a void left, and the ever-hungry black hole dwarfing the size of any galaxy. The scientists debated what would happen next, and no one knew for sure. But a mere 6 Earth-day cycles later, some sort of critical mass must have been achieved, and there was an eruption of energy. The ships and the debris dragged in over the last century were some ejected outwards, the anchor of the black hole now gone. Probes and analysis of this pocket dimension explosion revealed it had undergone a new Big Bang, with all matter ejected out, and already the beginnings of stars sparked within the closest clouds of ejected gas. The light was beautiful and terrible to behold, the birth of a new universe by murdering the old. So hear this tale, this legacy of our people, as you would dare to threaten humanity with your warships and your insults. We have graced this galaxy since before you gazed up at the stars in curiosity, and we have slain the closest thing to a god that has ever been known in this dimension. We can see the very threads of fate themselves, and twist and knit them to our own machinations as we wish. We have unmade and remade the very essence of the universe, and we would do so again if it means the safety of our people once more. So now we tell you, beg you, warn you, to pick up the gauntlet you have thrown down before us, lest we beat you to death with it,